All right, welcome back. So last time we finished up chapter 3, which is cells. This time moving on to chapter 4, as you can see, which is tissue. So one of the things I should probably tell you is what tissue is. So the gist of it is, and we didn't go through the intro chapter, and all this stuff is included in chapter 1 if you want to take the time to read it. But the gist of it is, so we start with cell theory, that organisms are made up of a variety of different cells that all work together to then produce a functioning organism, right? And so if you have a bunch of cells of the same type close to each other and working together, then that is a tissue. So for example, if you have a bunch of skeletal muscle cells that are all close together and working together, then that is skeletal muscle tissue. And when we combine multiple different types of tissue together, then we get an organ. So for example, in the case of an actual skeletal muscle, like biceps brachii, you're going to have not only skeletal muscle cells and skeletal muscle tissue, but in addition to that, you're going to have some connective tissue, you're going to have blood vessels. So if we have several different types of tissue working together, then we have an organ, right? So it works its way up from cells to tissues to organs, and then from organs on up to organ systems. So for example, when we talk about the cardiovascular system, we're going to talk about the heart, but also blood vessels, and so then that becomes that organ system. So today then, we've moved up a step from cells to a bunch of cells of the same type working together, so we moved up from cells to tissue. So there are 4 primary types of tissue. The first is epithelial. So the thing to know about epithelial tissue is that it is a covering and lining tissue. So for example, we find epithelial tissue in your skin, or your skin is epithelial tissue, right? It covers all of you. But we also find epithelial tissue in the respiratory tract. So when you breathe in and air goes down your throat, your trachea is lined with epithelial tissue, as are your lungs, and then the bronchioles that are between your trachea and your lungs. Your gastrointestinal tract, so for example, your esophagus, your stomach, and your intestines, those are also lined with epithelial tissue. So again, epithelial tissue, the key thing to know about it is that it is a covering and lining type of tissue. But in addition to epithelial tissue, we have connective tissue. So connective tissue does what you would think, it connects, right? So connective tissue serves as a connector between epithelial tissue and underlying tissues, we'll talk about here in a minute. It connects muscles to bones, it connects bones to bones. So connective tissue then connects things. It connects different tissues together. It connects, like I said, bones together or muscles to bones, and a variety of different things like that. So we'll spend some time in the next lecture talking about connective tissue. And then the other primary types of tissue are muscle tissue, which includes skeletal muscles, so your voluntary muscles like we talked about in 201, so muscles like your biceps brachii or your quadriceps group or your pectoralis major, those kinds of things, those are all skeletal muscles, so voluntary muscle. But muscle tissue also includes smooth muscle tissue, which, for example, is found around hollow organs like the stomach and intestines. And it also includes cardiac muscle tissue, so in the heart. And then the other primary type of tissue is nervous tissue, so neurons, like we talked about in 201. So the way this chapter, the way I'm going to break it out, is that in this first talk, I'm just going to talk about epithelial tissue. And then in the second talk, I'm going to discuss connective tissue and probably everything else. We'll see how far I get in the second talk. This might be a 3-lecture chapter. We'll see. But then we're not really going to talk much about muscle or nervous tissue because those are covered pretty extensively in 201. So we're going to spend most of our time here in the tissue chapter talking about epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So that said, so epithelial tissue first then. So as mentioned, epithelial tissue is a covering or lining tissue primarily. But in addition to that, epithelial tissue, there's a subtype of it which is glandular epithelium. So again, most of the epithelial tissue we're going to talk about is going to serve that covering or lining function. So for example, in the next module, we're going to talk about the skin, right? The whole thing is about the skin. So that is the covering effect of the skin. We'll talk about all the things that the skin does, but primarily it provides a barrier, keeps us from getting dehydrated, keeps us from allowing bacteria and other pathogens to get into the bloodstream. So it serves that barrier, that protective function, right? We'll also talk about the covering and lining functions in the digestive tract. So we'll spend a decent amount of time talking about how the stomach and the intestines work. And so again, talking about the covering and lining function of epithelial tissue. Glandular epithelium is found in those same places, right? So you've got glands in the skin that will secrete oil. You've got glands in the skin that will secrete sweat. You've got glands in the intestines that secrete intestinal juice. You've got glands in the respiratory tract that secrete mucus that help trap invading viruses and bacteria and dust and those kinds of things so that we can expel it. So we'll also talk a bit about the glandular functions, but mostly we'll talk about glandular functions as it relates to the digestive tract. So in epithelial tissue broadly, there are certain characteristics that are shared by most types of epithelial tissue. So the first one that you can see on there is apical basal polarity. What does that mean? So the apex of something, so think about like a pyramid. And so the apex of a pyramid is the very top of the pyramid. In the case of epithelial cells, the apical surface is the surface that either faces the exterior of the body or the surface of the cell that faces into a body opening. So, for example, if we're thinking about a cell in the small intestine, the apical surface of the cell is going to be the one that faces toward the inside of the intestine. So all the things that you swallow that make their way through the stomach and then into the intestines, that the inside of the intestine, as I've mentioned before, or the inside of a hollow organ is called the lumen. And so the apical surface, and lumen is spelled L-U-M-E-N, the apical surface of epithelial tissue then faces into that body cavity or into that lumen of the small intestine in this example. So you can think of it as the top of the cell is kind of a way to think of it, but some cells are upside down, right? So the apical surface then is the one that faces the external surfaces of the body or into a body opening or body cavity. The basal surface then is the opposite. So the basal surface is or can be viewed as the bottom of that cell, but again, sometimes cells are upside down. So the basal surface then, a way to think about it is connected to underlying tissue. So it is connected to the basement membrane. And the basement membrane has two parts to it. So I should probably explain a little bit more what the basement membrane is. So the basement membrane is a thin extracellular layer that typically consists of two sublayers, right? So extracellular, it's outside of the cell. And so the first of the two layers that make up the basement membrane is the basal lamina. And so the basal lamina is just underneath those epithelial cells, and it is actually secreted by the epithelial cells themselves. And you'll see this more when we talk about connective tissue. There are certain types of cells, so for example, fibroblasts in connective tissue, that secrete proteins like collagen that help sort of form the environment around them, help form the extracellular matrix. And so in the case of our epithelial cells, they secrete this external environment for themselves that helps create the basal lamina. So they secrete collagen and also glycoproteins. You don't need to know that word, but it's a combination of a sugar and a protein, and then proteoglycans, which are another combination sugar-protein. So that's the first layer of the basal lamina. The basement membrane is the basal lamina. The second layer is the reticular lamina. And so the reticular lamina is a little bit deeper, so it's farther from that apical surface. So the reticular lamina, farther from the apical surface, and it's closer to that underlying connective tissue, and it has collagen. So these strong, for example, your tendons are primarily composed of collagen, right? And so you've got these collagen fibers that make up the reticular lamina, again, the deeper layer of the basement membrane, that are secreted by the underlying connective tissue, specifically the fibroblasts in the underlying connective tissue. And so the basement membrane then is the point of attachment between the epithelial tissue and the underlying connective tissue. So the basal part of the epithelial cells helps anchor them to the underlying tissue. Is kind of the short version of things I want you to know. In terms of specialized contacts, so remember when we talked in chapter 3 about the interaction between cells. So we talked about that between cells you might have gap junctions, you might have desmosomes, or you might have tight junctions. So remember that tight junctions are going to basically anchor two cells together and keep things from slipping between them. And so your epithelial tissue then, because again it's a covering and lining tissue, it almost always, the cells are going to have tight junctions between them because they're going to try to prevent things from slipping between them. So for example, the skin, as we'll talk about with chapter 5, those keratinocytes, the skin cells, have lots of tight junctions between them to keep water from moving out of the body or moving into the body, or to keep pathogens from slipping into the body as well. And so one of the specialized contacts then are those tight junctions between the cells to keep things from slipping between them. So again, there's more information on that back in chapter 3. The other type of specialized contact that we see in epithelial tissue are desmosomes. So remember, desmosomes are kind of like a Velcro look to them, where they anchor cells together in areas where there's a lot of shear stress. So where one cell is moving up and the other cell is moving down, or yeah, let's stick with that. Or one cell's moving to one side, one direction, the other cell's moving the other direction. So for example, skin undergoes a lot of shear forces. So if something scrapes you or something comes into contact with you, that's then going to compress the skin and pull some cells one direction and other cells a different direction. And so to keep the skin from tearing then, to keep those cells from pulling apart, there are desmosomes between the cells to anchor them to each other. And we also see that in the intestines, for example. So your intestines have to be able to move around a lot, and they also do that, let's say while you're running. Let's say you go out, you're engaged in endurance running, and you go out and run for a long ways. That jarring effect of running is going to produce a lot of shear forces in a variety of tissues and organs, including in the small intestines. And so you've got desmosomes between those cells to keep them from pulling apart. So the specialized contacts then, the primary ones, are tight junctions and desmosomes. In terms of being supported by connective tissue, and these two actually go together, so with avascular but innervated. So your epithelial cells don't have, and I'll actually start down here, don't have direct blood supply. So if something is vascular, it means it has direct blood supply. If something is avascular, it means it doesn't have blood supply. So the epithelial cells then don't have capillaries running between them. So where they get the things that they need, where they get the oxygen that they need, how they get rid of the carbon dioxide they produce, how they get the amino acids, the building blocks for proteins that they need, all of that comes from the underlying connective tissue. Because you're going to have, and I'll actually click over to this picture. So this isn't the right cell type, but we'll ignore that for now. So we're going to pretend like this area is the lumen of the intestine. We're going to pretend like these are intestinal cells. Again, wrong shape, but that's okay. And then you've got the underlying, so you got the basement membrane here, and you'd have underlying connective tissue here. And so that connective tissue is going to have the blood vessels. And so things like oxygen, amino acids, carbohydrates are going to diffuse out of the bloodstream and into this connective tissue. And they're going to be floating around here in the extracellular matrix. And so these cells get the oxygen that they need, for example, or the proteins that they need, diffusing up from these blood vessels in the underlying connective tissue. So while epithelial tissue doesn't have a direct blood supply, it does get the things that it needs from the underlying connective tissue. And so that's where the supported by connective tissue comes in. In terms of regeneration, if something regenerates, it makes more of itself, or it repairs itself. And so in the case of epithelial cells, because it is primarily a covering and lining type of cell, there's a lot of contact with the outside world, or things passing through the digestive tract, things coming into the respiratory tract. And so there tends to be a lot of damage to these cells, and because there's a lot of damage, they have fairly short lifespans. We have to make new ones fairly often. So epithelial tissue then has a really high regenerative capacity. So it has to, we have to make new ones to repair damaged epithelial cells, or ones that have been sloughed off. All right. So in terms of the classification, so when we talk about epithelial tissue, it's always going to have two names. And the first name is based on the number of layers in that tissue, so it's one or more, and then the shape of the cells in that tissue. So, for example, epithelial tissue can either be simple, which is what you see here, where there is one layer of cells, or it can be stratified, which means that there are multiple layers of cells. And the short version of this is epithelial tissue, simple epithelial tissue, is going to be something we'll see in areas where there is absorption, where we're trying to take something into the body, where there's filtration, so we're moving from one side of a cell's membrane to the other, where there is secretion, so we're releasing something. So we're going to talk about simple epithelium primarily in terms of absorption, so like in the intestinal tract, but also we'll talk about it in terms of absorption in the case of the respiratory tract. So in the lungs, we'll talk about simple epithelium quite a bit. So simple epithelium, one cell layer thick. We see that where there is absorption, filtration, secretion. In the case of stratified epithelium, where there are multiple cell layers, we see that the primary example is the skin. So there's lots of layers of keratinocytes, skin cells stacked on top of each other because the skin's always coming into contact with the outside environment, so they're just getting constantly sloughed off. So we've got to have a lot of them. And so we see stratified epithelium in areas where there's a lot of friction, but areas where we need a lot of protection. So again, primarily the skin. In terms of their shapes, there are three shapes to epithelial cells. The first one is squamous, which is this one up here, looks like a square. Then we have cuboidal, again, looks like a cube. And then columnar, it is taller than it is wide, so they look like columns. So think, to Roman architecture where there's columns everywhere, right? So the columnar cells kind of look like those columns. In terms of where you see them, so you're going to see, we'll use both names. You'll see simple squamous epithelium, again, in areas where there's absorption. So we see simple squamous epithelium. We'll talk about it in the lungs more here on the next slide. We also see that lining blood vessels. Those are probably the two main areas where we're going to talk about it. In terms of cuboidal, we're going to see simple cuboidal, this. We'll see that in the kidney, so we'll talk about that quite a bit when we get to the kidney chapter. And then columnar, we're going to talk about mostly in the context of the gastrointestinal tract. Specifically, we'll talk about it mostly in the intestines. But we'll also talk about columnar epithelium in the respiratory tract as well. All right, so let's kind of go through them one by one. So with simple squamous epithelium, as mentioned on the previous slide, you're going to see that in areas where we need to absorb things or secrete things or filter them. So like I said, we're going to talk primarily about absorption and secretion. So for example, the picture on here is simple squamous epithelium inside of the lungs. So whenever you breathe air in, it goes down your trachea through two big airways called the bronchi, then to smaller airways called the bronchioles, and then eventually it ends up in these hollow sacs called alveoli. And so what you've got here are the pictures of the hollow sacs. So all this is air, and then this is your alveolar cells. Okay, and so air in here, and then alveolar cells here. So the reason that matters is, and you're also going to have not only the alveolar cells, and you can see the little arrows pointing to the nuclei of those cells, but you're also going to have blood vessels in here between some of those cells. So what we do when we breathe in is oxygen comes into the lungs. It eventually ends up in these little alveolar sacs, and then oxygen is going to diffuse into those nearby blood vessels. And so what we want to do, and usually the alveolar cells will be kind of over and around those blood vessels. And so what we want to do is have as thin of a membrane as possible for oxygen to diffuse into the blood. As we'll talk about when we get to the lung chapter, gas diffusion works on pressure gradient, so it's going to go from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So in the case of oxygen, you got higher oxygen pressure here in the alveoli. That high pressure is going to push it into your bloodstream where there's lower pressure. But oxygen can't diffuse very far, and so if you have a really thick membrane, then that's going to impede oxygen diffusion. It's going to make it harder to get the oxygen from the air that we breathe in into our bloodstream. So we want to minimize the number of cell layers that it has to pass through, because it's going to have to pass through at least two cell layers. It'll have to pass through the alveoli of, or the alveolar cells lining those alveoli. And then it'll have to pass through one of the cells lining the blood vessel. So the thicker that membrane is, the harder it's going to be for oxygen to diffuse. So, for example, we see that in the case of somebody who is a chronic smoker. They're going to start to accumulate things like tar in here, and then that's going to impede gas diffusion because it makes that membrane thicker. So the simple squamous epithelium in the lungs is important that it is that shape and that it's really thin to facilitate gas diffusion. So we onload oxygen and then offload carbon dioxide. Some of those alveolar cells are going to secrete different defensive proteins. So you have to, obviously you have things, like I said, dust, viruses, bacteria, et cetera, that make it down to the lungs. And so we have some protective proteins that are going to be secreted by those cells. So those are also simple squamous that secrete that. The endothelium is still a simple squamous tissue, but it is the simple squamous tissue that lines blood vessels. So it's on the inside of your arteries, of your veins, of your capillaries. Some capillaries, in fact, are only endothelium. So the endothelium then is essentially a special name for simple squamous epithelium inside of a blood vessel. And it is a little bit different than some of the other types of simple squamous epithelium in that it has a really slick friction-reducing lining, and so that allows red blood cells and other things in the blood to flow along nicely without getting stuck to the walls. And so it's kind of a way to think about it is as a sort of like Teflon coating to the inside of your blood vessels to keep things flowing nice and smoothly without sticking. The mesothelium, hopefully you'll remember back to PEPROF 201. If you haven't taken that class, that's okay. But we talked about inside of the chest cavity, or inside of the ventral body cavities, which includes inside of your chest, but also the abdominal cavity, you have serosa, or serous membranes, which hopefully you'll remember is a double-lined membrane. You have one layer of that membrane lining the organs in that cavity, and then one layer of the membrane lining the wall of that cavity. So where we talked about it a lot was related to the lungs. So you have one serous membrane lining the inside of your rib cage. That's the parietal serous membrane. And then you have another layer of serous membrane lining the outside of the lungs. That's the visceral serosa, or serous membrane. And so those two membranes, each of them secretes a lubricating fluid called serous fluid that helps the lungs slide inside of the rib cage. Whenever you breathe in, your lungs will slide against your chest wall, but you've got this nice lubricating fluid that helps them do that without dragging. And so how all that relates to the current discussion is those serosa, another name for them is the mesothelium. So those serous membranes are also known as the mesothelium. And so that includes the cells lining, again, the inside of the chest wall and the outside of the lungs, but also cells lining the outside of the stomach and then the inside of the abdominal cavity, and the same thing for the intestines as well. So again, just another special name. And those cells, their primary job is secretion. So they're going to secrete that serous fluid, that lubricating fluid, to help the organs slide either against each other or against the walls of that particular cavity. So that's simple squamous. Then on to simple cuboidal. Maybe, there you go. So again, the cuboidal cells are shaped like cubes, right? They look like little dice. And so simple cuboidal epithelium, again, involved in secretion and absorption. We're going to talk about it mostly later in the course when we get to the kidneys. So for example, here are some of your little kidney cells. And so this is along this kidney tubule here. And so what these cells do lining this tubule, and it's more evident down here, but they are going to be responsible for absorbing water, absorbing sodium, potassium, and some of the other electrolytes. So they're going to be involved then in absorption. So there's one thing I didn't mention a second ago, but I think it's on the next slide too, which is okay. So on the apical surface, in terms of apical basal polarity, there's a little bit different shape on the apical surface versus the basal surface. So a lot of the epithelial cells we're going to talk about have something called microvilli, and you can see that spelled for you here. What microvilli are these kind of hair-like projections from the apical surface of a lot of these epithelial cells, and what they do is they increase the surface area of the cell. So we see microvilli in epithelial cells that are involved in absorption. For example, in the intestines, specifically in the small intestine, those cells all have essentially a forest of microvilli, because we want to increase the surface area inside of the small intestine so that we can absorb sugar, proteins, fluids, etc. from the lumen of the intestine. Same concept here in the kidneys. So I mentioned this in 201 way back, and we'll talk about it more later when we get to the kidneys. But so your kidneys, their job is kind of to filter and clean the blood, right? So they help us get rid of urea, which is a byproduct of protein metabolism, and we can't have that accumulating in the blood, so we have to excrete it somehow. So one of the ways, the primary way, that we excrete it is through the kidneys. And so what we do then is we filter the blood, we pull out some of those things like urea, but we also pull out fluid, sodium, potassium, and like I said, some other electrolytes. But the vast majority of that we reabsorb. So for example, the kidneys filter about 180 liters of fluid per day, but you only actually excrete 1 to 2 liters as urine. And so the vast majority of the rest of that fluid is reabsorbed. And so these little simple cuboidal epithelial cells are going to do that reabsorption. They're going to pull the water inside of them and then move it to a nearby blood vessel. That fluid then returns to the blood vessel, returns to the circulation, and we've gotten rid of the urea in particular that we need to excrete again to avoid a toxic buildup. So simple cuboidal then, like I said, we're going to talk about it primarily in the kidneys. It does also line the walls of certain kinds of glands and also the ducts of certain kinds of glands. All right, and then a simple columnar. So remember, columnar cells are shaped like a column. So we're going to talk about those primarily in the digestive tract. And so you can see your line of simple columnar cells here. So here's one little columnar cell of the small intestine. Here's another one here, etc. And you can see their nuclei, right? And so this little white area here would be the lumen of the intestine. So if someone had eaten, right, there would be a wider gap here, and that would be filled with all of the macronutrients and fluids and things that we might want to absorb. So yeah, in the digestive tract. So as you would imagine, then that's associated with absorption. We're going to absorb carbohydrates, proteins, fluids, etc. We're going to move those inside of the cell and then out the basement membrane and into the underlying connective tissue and then into the underlying blood vessels, where then we'll do whatever it is we're going to do with those amino acids and carbohydrates. So those cells then are going to have microvilli, again, those hair-like extensions that increase surface area to help us absorb things. Some of them are going to be involved in secretion, and you can see that here with this goblet cell. So it's going to secrete mucus out here into the lumen of the intestine to help lubricate things. And then you've also got others that secrete intestinal juice, which plays a role in the digestive process. So simple columnar epithelium then, like I said, we're going to talk about it mostly in the digestive tract. Pseudostratified columnar is pictured there. So if something is stratified, obviously there are multiple layers. Anything pseudo is fake. So pseudo-stratified means it looks like it's stratified, but it's not. And the reason it looks like it's stratified is kind of this combination of there are these big mucin pockets, and then there are also nuclei at multiple heights. And so it looks like that there are multiple cell layers because of the nuclei at different levels and then the little mucin vesicles at different levels. So again, it looks like there are multiple cell layers, but in fact there's only one. And so it's pseudo-stratified because it looks stratified, but it's not. And so it is still effectively simple columnar epithelium. It just has a little bit different appearance. So we're going to see that primarily in the respiratory tract. And so there, we're talking mostly about secretion. So in these little respiratory cells, so as you can see, this is from your trachea, which is, when you breathe in, it's right at the front of your throat. That's your trachea. And so air then goes down the trachea and then to the bronchi, bronchioles, and then out to the lungs. So these cells then, in terms of secretion, so you've got a bunch of goblet cells interspersed in here. And so goblet cells secrete mucin or produce mucin, which is a precursor to mucus, which then lines the respiratory tract. And so the job of mucus in the respiratory tract is to trap invading pathogens. That's really its primary job. And then you can see the cilia here. So cilia are like microvilli, except that whereas for microvilli, the primary purpose is, again, increasing the cell's surface area to absorb things. In the case of cilia, they are more muscular, if you will. They actually contract and beat. So these little extensions will pull down, and so they sort of you get these waves of contraction of these cilia, and what that does is it pushes things along the respiratory tract. So typically we push things up the respiratory tract. So since these are in the trachea, what we'll do with viruses, bacteria, dust, etc., that get caught in the mucus of the respiratory tract is these little cilia beat one direction, they beat up toward the throat, and so we'll actually push those things, let's say the dust, up the trachea, and then it ends up in the esophagus, which goes down to your stomach, and then whatever things you trapped in that mucus will get killed by the acidity of the stomach. So you sort of finish off whatever has made it that far. So we're not really going to absorb there. You don't absorb any oxygen or anything like that in the trachea. Mostly, again, there you're going to see secretion. So one thing I do want you to know, so microvilli absorb, cilia are going to, they're similar cell extensions, but remember, cilia are not involved in absorption. They're going to be involved in moving things from one side of a cell surface to the other. So microvilli absorb, cilia move things across the cell's surface. All right, so then on to stratified epithelia. So remember, if you're stratified, you have multiple cell layers. So stratified squamous, one of the things about the skin is that the shape of the cell changes a little bit from the deepest cells to the most superficial. The most superficial cells are squamous, but the deeper ones have more of a cuboidal shape. So in terms of the naming of the tissue, it actually comes from the most superficial layer. So since the most superficial layer is square-shaped or squamous, then that's what makes it a squamous tissue. So as you can see there, stratified squamous, again, the skin, but that type of tissue, that there are multiple cell layers, continues a little ways into every body opening. As mentioned, the superficial cells are squamous, and also as mentioned, because epithelial tissue is avascular, those cells have to get their nutrients diffusing up from the underlying connective tissue. So one of the things you're probably familiar with is the idea that the most superficial cells in the skin are dead, right? So those keratinocytes are dead, and part of the reason that they are no longer living cells is because as these cells get farther and farther from the underlying basement membrane, oxygen can't diffuse all the way up to them, and so by the time they're kind of up in here, those cells are basically cut off from their nutrients. And so because they're cut off, they die, and so then these most superficial cells are dead cells. And we'll talk about this a lot more when we get to the skin chapter next week, but that's the idea. Keratin we'll also talk about. So keratin is a collagen protein inside of the cells, inside of those keratinocytes, that makes them really hard. In terms of stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, as you can see there, both of them are fairly rare. Apparently they're so rare, I don't have a picture. I thought I did, sorry. But you'll find them, for example, stratified cuboidal, you'll find in the sweat glands, and part of the reason you'll find multiple cell layers of cuboidal cells in a particular, so you actually see it in the oil glands, which are a type of sweat gland. Sebaceous glands is the name for those. So part of the reason you find it in those is because of the way that they secrete that oil. So effectively, those cells actually kind of explode. And we'll talk about that here in a second. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. But because of the way that they secrete, rather than just creating a vesicle and then releasing the oil onto the cell's surface, the whole membrane ruptures. And so that way you have multiple layers of those cells, so you can continue effectively uninterrupted oil production, which oil obviously produces, serves a protective function in the skin, keeps it from drying out, keeps the cells together, keeps us waterproof, or keeps water from slipping in and also water from slipping out. So it serves some important functions. But you've got multiple layers of cuboidal cells in those sebaceous or in those oil glands because of the way that they secrete, because the whole cell ruptures. And then a similar setup in the mammary glands. The pharynx is in your throat. And yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to the respiratory tract. Transitional epithelium, I won't ask you about, but basically it changes shape. So and the reason I won't ask you about it is because the only place it's found is in the urinary organs. So like your bladder has to be able to expand. So, as you consume more fluid, eventually your bladder is going to fill up and then you'll need to evacuate that. But when the bladder is empty, these little cells are all going to be right on top of each other. And then when the bladder is full, they're going to spread out a little bit. And so it's transitional because it essentially transitions from looking like or being stratified into more of a simple looking tissue. So it's kind of both, depending on whether or not the bladder is distended, which means stretched out, or not. All right, so let's talk about glands. So glands, as you can see there, could be one cell or could be multiple cells that secrete a certain product. So that product could be mucin, as we talked about earlier with the goblet cells. That could be intestinal juice. That could be different hormones, those kinds of things. So glands secrete some kind of a product. And so in terms of classifying glands, there's essentially two ways to classify them. The first is where they release their product. So glands can either be endocrine glands or exocrine glands. And so endocrine glands, which is spelled for you down here, the thing to know about them is that they secrete their product into the blood or into the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system, we'll talk about later, serves a fluid retention role, plays a role in the immune system as well. But endocrine glands, the thing I want you to know, they produce hormones, and then the products that they secrete are secreted into the blood or the lymphatic system. As opposed to exocrine glands, and I'm going to click over and click back. So the exocrine glands, you can see that spelled for you here. They're going to secrete their products either onto the body surface or into body cavities. All right, and then the other way to classify glands is based on the number of cells. So is it just a unicellular gland? So like a goblet cell would be an example there, or are there multiple cells involved in this gland? And then we can kind of subclassify from there based on the shape of the gland as well, as you'll see here in a second. So in terms of the endocrine glands, so as you can see there, they produce hormones. So hormones are chemical messengers. Examples of hormones that you're familiar with, like testosterone, which is associated with or commonly called the male hormone. Estrogen would be another example. Growth hormone, obviously, would be another hormone. So they're chemical messengers that, in general, flow in the blood, and then they flow to target tissues that have the receptors for those hormones, and then when the target tissue receives the hormone, it changes their metabolism. So they either start producing a protein or they become more or less active, those kinds of things. So my example that I have on here is in the small intestine. Some of those cells produce a hormone called cholecystokinin, and the abbreviation for that is CCK for short. And so what cholecystokinin does, or the way that the release is initiated, is if you consume a meal that is high in fat or high in protein. Both of those two things take longer to process than a meal that is high in carbohydrate. So digestion is just a slower process. And so, especially if it's a higher fat meal. In response to, so the food that you eat gets all mashed up in the stomach, obviously, and then when it leaves the stomach, it's something called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. We'll talk about that a lot in the digestive chapter. But that chyme, again, if it's high in fat, when the small intestine sees that, or when those small intestinal cells see that high-fat chyme, they're going to release this hormone called cholecystokinin. And so since they dump that hormone into the blood, again, it's going to circulate throughout the entire body, and whatever tissues have receptors for CCK will then respond to receiving that signal. So for example, one of the targets of CCK is the hypothalamus, which is kind of in the middle of your brain, sort of underneath it. But the hypothalamus is responsible for the hunger sensation. So in response to receiving CCK, because this is a high-fat meal, it's going to take a long time to digest, that reduces your hunger drive. So you feel full, produces a feeling of satiety is what that's called. And then because, again, CCK is going to travel in the blood, it's also received by the pancreas and then by the liver. So the liver produces bile, which is involved in breaking down fats, and then the pancreas produces pancreatic juice, which is also involved in breaking down fats. So when both of those, the liver and the pancreas, receive that chemical messenger, receive that CCK, they're going to produce or release bile and pancreatic juice to help in that digestion process. So that's kind of the way that those work. So long discussion there, but so the one thing I want you to know for now is that endocrine glands, well, two things, produce hormones, one, and then two, again, they release their product into the blood or the lymphatic system. Again, as opposed to exocrine glands that secrete their products onto the body surfaces or into body cavities. So our goblet cell down here would be an exocrine gland because the mucus that it's going to secrete is going to be into a body cavity, whether that is into the respiratory tract or into the digestive tract. So that would count then as an exocrine gland. So it's still, inside of the body, kind of, but it's really into a body opening, and so then that counts as being outside of the body effectively, right? And then other ones, and we'll talk about these a lot in the next chapter. So your sebaceous or your oil glands, and then your sweat glands. So you got glands in the skin that are going to release a lot of water, and then sodium, potassium, and some other products like urea. So those sweat glands then would fall into the category of exocrine glands because they're going to secrete their product onto a body surface, in this case onto the skin surface. So in terms of classifying glands with respect to, and again, the second way to classify them is based on the number of cells. So glands can either be unicellular, so like our little goblet cell here is unicellular. Some of those intestinal glands, or the intestinal glands that produce CCK, are unicellular as well. So we're going to see those in the intestinal and respiratory tracts between the mucus and the goblet cells. Our multicellular glands then, so like I said, we can subclassify them based on the way that they're shaped is a way to think about it. So what do their ducts look like? So are they simple or compound? A simple one is just a straight tube like this. Compound has branches. So is there just one main passageway, or are there branches off of it? And then what do the secretory units look like? So are they tubular, meaning they look like a tube, or are they alveolar in that they look like grapes? So alveolar are kind of, they look like little sacs, basically. Like I said, they look like grapes, just pretend the grape is hollow. That's an alveolar shape. And so usually when we're talking about alveoli or alveolar, we're talking about them in the lungs, but it is actually based on the shape of the cell, or in this case, the shape of the gland. Another way to subclassify them is based on their mode of secretion. So merocrine, the way that works, and you can see the different examples of those. So glands in the pancreas, your sweat glands, and your saliva glands all use a merocrine mode of secretion. And so what they do, and I don't think I have a good picture. Oh, there I do. Okay, good. Is they produce their product, and then so tying this back into chapter 3. So they're going to generate those proteins into the rough endoplasmic reticulum. They're going to then pinch those proteins off into little vesicles, probably modify them in the Golgi apparatus, and then that vesicle is going to migrate to the cell membrane on the apical surface, and then it'll fuse with that and it'll dump its product out. So you'll dump out sweat, so the fluid plus the electrolytes plus urea. You'll dump out the saliva, so the fluid plus some of those digestive enzymes. Same thing with the pancreas. But an important part is with merocrine secretion, the cell remains intact. So you just got this nucleus that is, the mRNA is copying the instructions for the proteins. We're building the proteins in the endoplasmic reticulum via the ribosomes, and then we're just pinching them off and exporting them out of the cell. So merocrine glands make vesicles, and then the vesicles fuse with the membrane. They open up, and then you secrete whatever their product is outside of the cell, either into the body's opening, or into the body cavity or onto the skin surface or outside of the body. As opposed to holocrine glands, and I mentioned this a minute ago, with your sebaceous or with your oil glands, what they do is the whole cell ruptures, right? And so the cell explodes, releases the product, releases the oil, but then that cell's gone. And so that's why we have that stratified cuboidal type of tissue that I was talking about earlier, is because once this cell's gone, now this cell has to fill in. And then you would, at the bottom here, and you can actually see it the way they've got this little drawing, this means these two cells are reproducing. And so because you've got a relatively high rate of turnover, you're going to have these cells undergoing mitosis. They're going to be making copies of themselves and splitting. And so you're going to have this mitotic layer down here. And so mitotic layer just means you've got a layer of cells that are making copies of themselves. They're splitting and making new exact copies. And so you have to have that mitotic layer down here because of the death of these cells up here, because they keep exploding and releasing their fragments. All right, so that's it for epithelial tissue. Not the most riveting, I know. The next time we'll get on to connective tissue, which for me at least is a little bit more interesting, because connective tissue, now we're going to start to talk about ligaments and tendons and a lot of things involved in movement that I find a little more interesting than, the skin and the intestines. So we'll see you next time.